Hi all, welcome to the Azure AD B2C webinar series. Today we have a session on custom policy walkthrough. We're joined by John Garland from WinElect, and he will be diving into this a bit more. He's a VP in the space, and he'll dive into a bit more of his intro. And we're also joined on the Q&A side by Vinu and Jazz, who are both program managers for Microsoft. And we'll dive into a bit more of the session. So this week will be the custom policy part 2 of the walkthrough, and then we'll have another session coming up. And then if you haven't been able to join for the other ones, there are the recordings that are going to be posted as well to be able to go through. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to John and the rest of the team on Q&A as well to dive into today's session. We really appreciate you joining, and thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Sophia. Hello to everyone and welcome. My name, as Sophia said, is John Garland, and I'm the Vice President for Cloud Development at WinElect. We've been an award-winning Microsoft partner for many years with a focus on both consulting and training in Azure, as well as other Microsoft and related technologies. I myself am a Microsoft Azure MVP, a Microsoft certified trainer, and an instructor at WinElect. In fact, I teach a course that WinElect offers to help our partners learn how to effectively use Azure AD B2C. I've also written some extensive posts covering Azure AD B2C. You can find out more about me and WinElect and see the content I've written at winelect.com, and I also tweet at the .NET Gator alias. As Sophia mentioned, also on the call with us today are Vinu Gunasekaran and Jaz Suri from Microsoft to handle Q&A. They're both Azure AD B2C program managers. This session is part of the Azure AD B2C webinar series covering identity protocols and Azure AD B2C custom policy deep dives. In the previous session, we introduced the concepts behind Azure AD B2C custom policies. And in this session, we'll put those concepts into practice by walking through the creation of a custom policy. So thank you for joining us today. We're very excited that you're here. In today's session, we're going to review the exercise that we introduced last week. We're going to show the steps to get started with creating an Azure AD custom policy for a loyalty number policy example. We're going to set up a workspace with the policy files for our new custom policy. We'll define the loyalty number claim to be collected. We'll configure the user account profile editing experience to include the information we need to collect from the user. We're going to modify the policy to read and write that information to the backing Azure AD directory storage. We'll update the user journey to include gathering information if certain conditions are met. And then we'll return the user information we collected in the set of claims that are included in the token that's going to be returned by the policy. Today's content does assume that you're familiar with the prerequisite material that is outlined in the session description. This includes an understanding of what Azure AD B2C is, knowing how to do basic configuration and user flow creation using Azure AD B2C, and understanding basic Azure AD B2C use cases. Also, if you haven't seen the previous sessions in this series, you may want to check out the recordings in order to supplement what we're going to be going over today. Okay, let's get started. In the previous session, we presented the scenario that we would like to walk through today. To review, assume that your project has asked you to configure Azure AD B2C to sign up new customers or sign in existing customers. Users will only use local credentials, no third-party identity providers quite yet. Beyond customers' email addresses, first and last names, you're also going to need to collect a loyalty number from your customers. A loyalty number is basically one of those grocery store, membership point, club numbers kind of things. However, you want to make sure that the initial sign up for your customers is as quick and brief as possible. So you don't want to really bother them with the loyalty number information right up front. This is known as a progressive profiling technique, where you initially prompt the users for the bare minimum information you need to collect for them, but then you can gradually ask for more and more information until you've completely built up their profile. We've published the scenario for you at the link below, and the write-up published up here includes a walkthrough of a version of the solution that we're going to be going over today. So let's also review the steps that were discussed in the previous session that you'll need to take to get started with setting up an Azure AD B2C tenant to work with custom policies. First, you're going to need to create an instance of the Azure AD B2C service. This will create a special Azure AD tenant that is set up with elements it needs to work with Azure AD B2C. You then need to link that tenant back to a resource in an Azure subscription so the B2C billing can be managed through that Azure subscription. Next, you'll need to create keys that your custom policies will use to both sign and encrypt the tokens that it's going to issue. You're going to be assuming you're working with local accounts, you're going to register a pair of applications that allow your policies to use the Azure AD B2C tenants OpenID Connect endpoints to sign in those users. If you're working with custom claims, you'll also need to obtain a couple of values that will be used to work with the underlying Azure AD data store to save and retrieve those claims. And finally, not part of this example, but if your policy works with external identity providers like Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc., you're going to need to register your Azure AD B2C instance with those identity providers and then use the values that those identity providers give you to configure your policy to work with them. Basically, you need to tell them about your policy. You need to tell your policy about them. Don't worry if this seems like a lot to remember. These steps are all documented in the Getting Started section of the Azure AD B2C custom policy documentation. And generally, you only do them once for a given Azure AD B2C tenant. Let's take a look at this in action. So as you go through this initial setup process, you're going to be recording some values. You'll generally maintain a little table for yourself somewhere where you chart out all these values and gather them up as you prepare them. You'll need the tenant name and the various values, the various names of the keys and the applications that we're going to be creating. So let's take a look at how you go about that. I have an Azure AD B2C tenant here set up and ready to go. The first thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to record the tenant name. So it's here, it's Azure AD B2C webinar series. I'll be using that throughout the policy setup. The next thing I do is when you're working with custom policies, you'll come down here to the Identity Experience Framework section. To get started, the first step, you're going to need to create your signing and encryption keys. So we'll walk through that. We'll select Add a Key. You can either import existing keys or for the most part, you'll just have B2C generate these keys for you. And I will use the names that the instructions recommend I use, a token signing key container, an RSA, and this one is used for signing. I'll go ahead and select Create. And then the next one is token encryption key container. Again, RSA. And this one is used for encryption. And you'll want to record those names. You'll need them later. The next thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to create a couple of application registrations. I'll come over here to the New Application Registration Experience, select New Registration, and the first application I'm going to register is called Identity Experience Framework. These are applications that your B2C tenant is going to use, not applications that you're going to be exposing to the applications to your apps that need B2C for authentication. So named it Identity Experience Framework. I want accounts in this organization only, and then I need to give it a redirect URI. This will be the redirect URI for my Azure AD B2C tenant. It'll be the tenant name.b2clogin.com and then the tenant name.onmicrosoft.com. I need to make sure this grant admin consent is checked, and I'll select register. I need to record this application ID. Let me get that down. And then I need to do some additional configuration. I need to expose an API. I'm going to add a scope. I'll take the default value for the application ID URI, and then the scope name is going to be named user impersonation. Tab in there, and some descriptive information about it. It's being used to access the Identity Experience Framework, and some more description allows access to the Identity Experience Framework. Okay, now that this application is configured, we've got one more. The Proxy Identity Experience Framework, accounts in this organization only. This one will be a native application, and we'll use the default myapp/auth URI for it. Again, make sure grant admin consent is checked there. And we need to record our application ID as well. Okay. Now we need to go back to configure this a little further. We need to make sure that we've set that this is being treated as a public client. So check that to yes. And then we need to come over here to API permissions and add a permission. We'll go to My APIs. We'll select the Identity Experience Framework we just created and check it. By the way, don't worry too much about these steps. They're documented for you. Just follow them as documented. Select Grant Admin Consent and hit yes. And now this is all set up and ready to go. The other value that I need back here in Applications, select All Applications, and there's this B2C extension app, do not modify, etc. We need to obtain a couple values from it. We need to record the application ID, and we need to record the object ID. Again, we're going to need these a little bit later as we go through our custom policies. Okay, so those values are recorded. We're ready to move forward with our custom policies. The next step that we need to do is prepare our policy files. To get started, you can either download or clone the custom policy starter pack. Next, you use the appropriate starter pack files to create a workspace with the files you're going to edit for the policy that you're creating. You'll update these files with your Azure AD B2C tenant name. You'll update the policy settings based on the values that we just collected. And then we'll create the relying party element for our policy and the user journey that relying party is going to reference. At this point, it's probably a good idea to deploy and test your policy to make sure that all this configuration that we've done is working and is working properly. Sorry. One of the keys to effectively developing custom policies is to move in small increments and to test your progress pretty often. Before we go too much further, I want to recap. The previous session briefly introduced the concept of inheritance and composition across custom policy files. When policy files inherit from each other, you basically start with the base file and work your way down the inheritance chain. And as you encounter elements with the same ID, those elements are merged with the child elements that have the same ID and same name, overriding the corresponding parent elements. To illustrate, here we have an example of that kind of merging. I've got in my parent or base file a claim called given name with a display name, a data type, and so on. And then my child file takes and overrides the display name that's defined up in the parent. When the Identity Experience Framework interprets this collection of policy files, it's going to interpret that given name claim as having a display name that was defined in the child and all of the other attributes as they were defined in the parent. We're going to be taking advantage of this a lot as we work through our policy. So keep this in mind, keep this kind of inheritance in mind. So let's start setting up our policy workspace and our policy files. Come over here to a folder that I have set up for this, and I'm going to open up an instance of the terminal here in this folder, and I'm going to clone down the files in the starter pack. This will just take a minute. And great, the custom policy starter pack has been cloned. If I see I've got the files there and I can go into the directory. Let's open this in Visual Studio Code. We're going to be using Visual Studio Code with the Azure AD B2C extension installed in this session. We'll go over a little bit more detail about the B2C extension for Visual Studio Code in the next session in this series. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take our local accounts folder that has all of our policy files, and we're actually going to copy that. And we'll go ahead and rename this Progressive Profile. So now we've got a folder with some dedicated files for our custom policy. I'll go to the Trust Framework base file, and I'm going to update everywhere that says your tenant. I'm going to update it with the name of our Azure AD B2C tenant. So put that there and copy that there. In my Trust Framework extensions file, I'm going to do the same, but I also have to update the base policy entry to reference the tenant as well. And I'm going to do the same for my sign up or sign in file. The sign up or sign in references the extensions file. The extensions file references the base file. We've got this nice hierarchy going. I'm going to rename my sign up or sign in file, and I'm going to call it Progressive Profile Sign up or sign in. And likewise, I'm going to update the ID of our policy, and I'm just going to call that Progressive _. And that has to be updated in the policy ID here, and it also has to be updated in the public policy URI. Great. So we've got our hierarchy set up. We've got our policy ID. We now need to go and update the ID values that we just collected when we were configuring our Azure AD B2C tenant. We'll start with the base file, and we're going to locate the JOT issuer. This is the policy, the technical profile that issues our claims for us, our token at the end of our user journey for us. And we'll make sure that the user secret and the user refresh token keys match the values that we collected earlier when we defined our signing key and our encryption key. We use the default values when we name them per the instructions, and the custom policy starter pack is set up so those values are ready to go. We don't need to do anything there. In our extensions file, we need to locate this login non-interactive technical profile, and we need to update the client ID and the ID token audience and the resource ID values based on those applications we just created a minute ago. So we will start with the proxy value and paste that in here. And then we will come back to the Identity Experience Framework applications client ID here. Notice this technical profile seems to be missing some data. It doesn't indicate a protocol or anything else. That's because it's actually extending the one that was defined in the Trust Framework base. Login non-interactive, if we come on over to Trust Framework base and locate the login non-interactive technical profile, there's a lot more in here. But the extensions file content extends the content that's defined here. This is an OpenID Connect technical profile. It's configured and it's used to sign in a user to the underlying Azure AD data store. You'll see it's using a password credentials grant type, and everything is set up already to speak to the underlying Azure AD tenant. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we need to come over here into our base file, and we need to pull our user journey for the sign up or sign in user journey. We'll go ahead and take that, copy that, and come into our extensions file and add that in here. And let me fix the tabbing on that. So I'm taking the pre-existing sign up or sign in user journey. I'm actually going to rename it sign up or sign in progressive. We'll make changes to this one to achieve the goals that were set up in our scenario. Finally, in our relying party file, and the file that defines our relying party elements, we're going to tell it to use this new user journey as its default user journey. With all that set up, let's go ahead and upload these policies and try them out and make sure that everything works. So we'll come back over here into our Azure AD B2C tenant, go into custom policies and select custom policy. As you upload your custom policies, the policy files that you upload are parsed against the definitions from the Identity Experience Framework and against the definitions from other policies that have already been uploaded. So you need to make sure that whatever you upload, everything that's declared in it has already been declared in other policy files or declared in that file. Put another way, you start uploading with the base file and you work your way down. So we'll select Upload Custom Policy. We'll start with the base file, upload it. Then we will go into our extensions file, upload it. And finally, we will upload the progressive profile file. And we'll go ahead and click on this, select Run Now. I've already declared the jot.ms application that was shown in earlier sessions for us to work with. And let's go ahead and sign up a new user. So we'll select myself. Let me put in my information. As I wait for my authentication code to come in, there it is, 705-407. Verify that code, create. And sure enough, okay, we were able to create our user. The policy is all set. We're in good shape. I'm going to delete that user so that I can do more with him later. But we know that our policy works. Okay, so let's look at the user journey and the custom policy that we have so far. Currently, our sign up or sign in progressive user journey is made up of 4 steps. The local account sign in is a special hybrid step that shows the combined sign up and sign in UI. If the user opts to sign in, the technical profile in this step uses a validation technical profile to call the login non-interactive OpenID Connect profile, which we saw, and this makes an OpenID Connect call to the endpoint provided by our B2C tenant's Azure AD instance. This call attempts to verify the user's credentials and returns, among other things, an object ID for the user's account if they are valid. Looking at that in the code, come back up to our extensions, we'll see our step 1 calls the self-asserted local account sign-in email technical profile. That's defined up here in the base. Self-asserted local account sign-in, we'll see as a self-asserted technical profile. And it calls a validation technical profile of login interactive, which again, this is the one that we looked at a moment ago, when the user, if the user actually signs in at this point. The next step checks if an object ID value exists in the claims bag. So if the user signed in, that object ID will exist there. If it doesn't, the journey calls a technical profile that prompts the user to sign up with a local account. This profile also uses a validation technical profile, this time one based on the Azure AD protocol, to create a user account in the underlying Azure AD tenant data store. This process will also return an object ID, this time the object ID of the created user. So if we look at that, we'll come back to our user journey. We'll see it calls the local account sign up with login email technical profile. In the base, if we go to local account sign up with logon email, we see again self-asserted technical profile. It's going to collect, among other things, the email, the password information, display name, given name, and surname for the user. And then it will call the validation technical profile AAD user right using logon email. We look at that. That is, we'll talk about how this is set up. It is an Azure AD technical profile, and it will persist several claims to the underlying Azure AD data store. The next step, a technical profile is called that reads the user details based on the user account's object ID, whether that object ID was obtained from the sign up or the sign in step. This basically creates a level set of claims that we have available for the user, regardless of how we obtained that particular user. So again, back to our user journey. We use the Azure, the AAD user read using object ID technical profile. This will read values back out. And finally, a JOT token will be assembled and returned back to the calling application. So once again, we come over here and it'll use that JOT issuer technical profile that we briefly looked at when we first started. The next step to extend the policy to meet the scenario is to add a custom claim to represent the user's loyalty number. Since Azure AD B2C doesn't have a pre-existing claim that meets this need, you'll need to extend the schema by defining a custom claim. We went over custom claims in the last session in this series. This claim will have an ID of extension underscore loyalty number, a display name of loyalty dash number, a data type of string, some text to help the user know what to enter, and it will be collected with a text box control. Let's take a look. So back in our extension file, we'll come on over here to the building blocks section, and we will add our custom claim definition with the values that we just described. Extra line there. Okay. With the claim defined, it's time to assemble or update the user interface that will be used to collect it. This involves defining and configuring a self-asserted technical profile. Recall that any output claim in a self-asserted technical profile that includes a user input type declaration is used for data collection. Make a note of this. I'm going to come back to this in half a second. In addition to the data that is to be collected, self-asserted technical profiles also include a content definition metadata element that determines the HTML that's going to provide the look and the feel of the user interface. The thing I said I was going to come back to, there is another way to define claims for data collection in a self-asserted technical profile. It's currently in preview, and this is through the use of a display claims element. Now, right now, output claims in a self-asserted technical profile do double duty. They determine what claims will be put on the user interface for the user to interact with, and they determine what claims are going to be put into the claims bag when the technical profile finishes executing. That can sometimes cause you to have to do some gymnastics in terms of, well, you may want to write different things than are being put on the user interface or other issues. So with the use of the display claims elements, you can actually go ahead and separate that functionality out. If you include display claims, only the display claims declared are used in the user interface elements, and the output claims are only responsible for putting things into the claims bag at the end of the technical profile's execution. The challenge, the problem, the thing you need to be careful with this is that when you're working with inheritance, your parent may be assuming that things are being defined in output claims. Your child is going to use display claims when the technical profile is merged by the identity experience framework with the whole inheritance thing. It will see that there's a display claims declaration and it will ignore the output claims elements. So you need to be careful if you're using display claims and inheritance in a self-asserted technical profile. Nonetheless, let's take a look at adding collecting our loyalty number claim inside of our policy. Now, one of the things we're going to do here is we're going to take advantage of a pre-existing self-asserted technical profile. In particular, we're going to use the profile update self-asserted technical profile. This has the added bonus of if we include a edit profile policy inside of our application, it's already configured to gather the loyalty number as well as what we present for the user to enter. So let's come back to our editor here. And in our extension policy, an extension file, we're going to add another claims provider. We're going to use the self-asserted profile update, and we're going to add the loyalty number as a claim that we're going to collect in that in that technical profile. If we come back to our base and we find the self-asserted profile update, we'll see it's already working with given name and surname. Okay. Sorry, and one thing else I wanted to show in the base file before I forget, that profile update technical profiles also using a validation technical profile, in this case the AAD user right profile using object ID. So when you finish editing your claims inside of this user interface, when the user is finished providing their input, those values will be saved back to the Azure AD data store. Speaking of which, let's talk for a minute about how we would go about writing our users to the user information to the underlying Azure AD data store. And first, I want to talk a little bit more about inheritance with Azure AD B2C policies, and in particular with technical profiles. In addition to inheritance between policy files and elements with matching IDs, there is another inheritance strategy that we can take advantage of with technical profiles in Azure AD B2C custom policies. Technical profiles can use the include technical profile element to configure an inheritance chain between different technical profiles. This allows several different technical profiles to share the elements defined in a common base profile. This is most often used in Azure AD technical profile declarations. So to illustrate, here we see sharing an example of sharing technical profile definitions through the include technical profile declaration. You see the 4 technical profiles on the bottom all include an include technical profile reference to the AAD-common technical profile. So they may have their own individual functionality that's defined throughout the rest of the technical profile, but they inherit also all of the common values, including the display name, the protocol, and anything else that's defined up here in the common value. We'll see how that's really helpful here in just a moment. So back in our extensions file, we're going to add another claims provider, and in this case, it's going to be this AAD-common. We're going to actually extend the AAD-common technical profile that's defined up here in the base. If we come and look at it, it defines a protocol and a couple of other attributes. In addition, we're going to provide this with the IDs that we collected earlier when we were setting up our Azure AD B2C tenant, and this will allow our Azure Active Directory technical profiles to work with custom claims. So we come back to these values, and we'll get the object ID that we recorded earlier. Put that in here. And the client ID that we recorded earlier. And also record that. So now any technical profile that references the AAD common as an inherited technical profile will have these values available when it comes to working with custom policies. We'll add a couple more technical profile declarations here and clean this up. The first one we have here is for writing profile elements using an object ID. We're extending the predefined one to include persisting the loyalty number claim. And we also have our read value, our read profile that we're extending so that when it reads, it's also going to include the technical profile, the loyalty number claim on the way back out. So let's review our user journey real quick. We started with showing the sign-in form, sign-up link, and password reset values. And if the user provides credentials, then we'll go ahead and log them into the local account. We'll validate their credentials and return an object ID. The second step, if the user signed in and we already have an object ID, we're going to go ahead and skip this step. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and register the user with a new account. We'll create that account in the directory through the use of a validation technical profile, and we return the user's object ID. Then we'll go ahead and use that object ID to read the user's attributes from the directory for the current user account. Now we'll have a uniform set of claims available for the current user account. And then we'll go ahead and assemble a JOT token and return that back to the calling application. To meet our criteria, though, to meet our scenario, we need to do one more thing. What we'll need to do is we'll need to insert a step that checks to see if the loyalty number claim already exists. We don't need to do anything. If we have a new user signing up for the first time, we don't want to bother them, so we're going to go ahead and skip this step as well. But otherwise, we have no loyalty number and the user is not brand new. We're going to prompt the user to enter their loyalty number, showing the UI that we just created, and we'll save that value back to the directory. And then again, the token will be returned. Now, how do we accomplish that skip this step logic? Well, steps can optionally be executed in a user journey through the use of preconditions. An orchestration step can declare one or more preconditions, and those are evaluated when it's time for the orchestration step to run. If a precondition is matched, the action gets run. Right now, the only action that you can specify in a precondition is skip this orchestration step. There are two types of preconditions you can declare: claims exist and claim equals. Claims exist checks to see if a given claim exists in the claims bag. Claim equals checks a claim against a value that you provide. Remember though, the first precondition to match executes its action. There is no support right now for Boolean matches like and or, but you can declare additional steps, additional claims, and use some claims transformations to do some logical processing on your values in an earlier step. And then when you reach the step that you want to determine if it should run, evaluate that value. Also, you can invert the logic of these checks by adding an execute actions if attribute. So as an example, the technical profile with an ID of sample user collector is skipped if the claims bag contains an object ID claim. The precondition checks for the object ID with a claims exists check, and if it exists, because the execute action if is set to true, it'll perform the skip this orchestration step action. So again, let's add a new user journey step and use preconditions to meet our scenario here. So we need to go to our user journey in our extensions file, and we need to add a new fourth step. Let's tidy that up a bit, and you'll see here, it's going to check to see if the loyalty number claim exists, and if it does, execute actions if is true, it's going to skip the current step. The next thing it's going to do is check to see if a claim called new user exists, and if it exists, we're going to skip this step as well. Where did new user come from? Well, if we come back into the base file, we'll see this claim is declared up in the base file. It's actually emitted by the Azure Active Directory technical profiles that write to the underlying Azure AD data store. If the new user is created, this claim will be set up for us and available for us to use. So we can go ahead and use that to determine if we should bother or not bother the user with collecting the loyalty number. If we've determined that we can execute this step, we'll go and execute that profile update technical profile that we modified and extended a second ago to collect their loyalty number. The next thing we need to do, because we've inserted a new step 4, we need to now insert a new step or update, sorry, the JOT token to be step 5. So looking at the user journey that we started with, remember this illustration from earlier, what we've done now is we've inserted a new fourth step that shows the profile editing self-asserted technical profile. That technical profile in turn will use a validation technical profile to write the updated user information back to the underlying Azure AD data store, which includes the new loyalty number claim value. The final change to discuss is to include the new loyalty number claim in the resulting JOT token. To include a claim in the token, you need to add the claim in the output claim section of the relying party element for your policy. There are a couple of interesting things worth mentioning about claim type references, and this applies not only to the relying party section, but several other places that claim type references are included. First, you can use the default value attribute to include a value to use for a claim if it doesn't already exist in the claims bag. So perhaps we may want to specify a value name like unset in our token if the loyalty number claim hasn't been set. Otherwise, the claim just is simply completely omitted from our token. Second, you can use the partner claim type attribute to give the claim an alternate name when it's exchanged with a partner. For example, if your application is dependent on the claim having the specific name loyalty number and including the extension underscore prefix would cause a problem in your application code, you can specify this different exchange name. This is really useful for HTTP requests where an external web API may already be defined and may not directly align with the claim names that you're using in your policy. You can just tell the REST technical profile, the claims that you declare in that profile, the names to use when it's sending or receiving those claims. So let's go ahead and add our loyalty number to the set of claims to be returned. We come on over into our relying party section, and we can add our loyalty number to be emitted. But let's actually go a little fancier than that. Let's comment that out. And instead, we're going to return the loyalty number, but also, if it has no value, if we have no loyalty number, we'll return unset. So maybe our application needs to know that it's not set. And we're going to use the name loyalty number when it's actually being emitted from our policy. Okay, it's a lot so far. Let's go ahead and try and upload our policy files and see the execution of our policy and see if we've met our scenario. I'll go ahead and select upload custom policy. We didn't make any changes to our base file, so we'll need to start with our extensions file. We defined some things in there. I'll go ahead and select it. Be sure to select overwrite if it already exists when you're uploading a file that's already up there. And then we'll go ahead and do the same for our relying party file. Let's go ahead and run this. And let's sign up a new user. And once again, use that email. And while the code is being emailed to me, enter the rest of the information. And there's my code. 942538. Verify my code. Create my user. And sure enough, the new user was created. I wasn't bothered to enter a loyalty number. My sign up experience was nice and simple. My loyalty number claim was returned to me with the value of not set. Let's run this again. And this time I'm just going to try and sign in. Select sign in. And sure enough, now I'm being prompted to enter my loyalty number. I'll do ABC123. And my loyalty number has been saved and returned inside of my token. One more time. I'll sign in again. And now I'm not prompted because we already do have the loyalty number. It's being returned in the claim. So our policy has met the goals that were identified in our scenario. Okay, well, with that done, please be sure to take a few minutes to complete the feedback survey, and we'll see if there's a few questions that we can address here.
Okay, I'm just going to read out.
Is a norm to create custom claim token like user system roles where it retrieves from the external database via a REST API? I think the question is about getting custom claims and how you use an API to fetch those custom claims.
Yeah, and there's a couple things to remember with claims. I like to think of policies as kind of a program, and claims are the variables. Claims can have different uses. You may want to, and variables in a program can have different uses. You may want to display some of them in the UI to collect information from a user. You may need to declare claims and variables that you're going to be exchanging with external APIs to either validate information in the external API or collect supplemental information in an external API or even save information with an external API. Or you may also need claims that you're going to be using to gather information that's stored in the underlying data store. Like in some programs, it's a database. Some programs, it's to disk. In Azure AD B2C policies, it's to the underlying Azure AD data store. So certainly, and there's one more use for claims. You may not store them anywhere. You may just use them for internal processing logic, just like variables in a program. So yes, it is absolutely normal to use claims in any of those capacities inside of your policy programs.
Awesome. So the next question is, thank you for the great webinar series. It's very helpful. We have a few questions. Do you plan to include a visual tool for creating custom policies, something like a logic app designer where you can drag and drop elements, technical profiles, user journeys, relying parties, etc., that will generate the XML behind? I can probably take this question. So what we currently have is a Visual Studio Code, a B2C extension tool where it can solve some of the questions that you've asked, where it can generate some pieces of XML. This is like a smart copy and paste, and you can easily navigate through the custom policies using the Visual Studio Code extension. So that can solve some parts of it, but something like a logic app designer is we are exploring internally to see how we can give you a better experience for development purposes. So that's something that we are exploring. Okay, so I will take the next question. So John, this is for you. In preconditions collection in the journey, can we control logic like and or?
Okay, yeah, I went over this briefly. Yeah, you cannot directly do any kind of complex logic in preconditions like and or. The only thing you can do is you can negate with that execute actions if. However, you can include a previous step in the user journey that calls a claims transformation. There are a bunch of Boolean claims transformations. So while you can't do it directly in the precondition inside of that particular user step, you can include a step ahead of that would evaluate the resulting and or value and then act on your precondition on that particular value.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. How do we display different user-friendly messages according to the return code that we get from the RESTful API?
Okay, so you want to display different text based on, so let's say you called an external API and it returns 1, 2, 3, or 4, and you need to determine some text that needs to be displayed based on code 3 as opposed to code 1. And again, this is where you really want to look at your claims transformations, because there are lookup claims transformations that you can use that basically say, given a claim value of this, set another claim to a value of that. So one could have, the sky is blue, 2 could be the sky is red, and messages according to that. And you can go ahead and return and basically transform the result of the incoming API request to the value that you want to then display on the user interface. The way you would display it on the user interface depends exactly on what you're doing with it, but you may use like a paragraph data type, claim type user display type for that particular claim or something along those lines, depending on what your need is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, the next question is, can we clone and upgrade an existing policy? It seems it uses a different base policy than in the custom starter pack.
Yeah, they're asking about, basically, I think they're asking about setting up a user flow, pulling that down and using that as a starter point for a custom policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the quick answer there is, I'll say technically no. There may be some underhanded things that you can do. We won't go too much further into discussing now. There's some trickery maybe, but for the general case, you can pull down the relying party version of a user flow, but you don't get much of the innards there. But you can pull down some version of that predefined user flow. There is a download button in the UI, and you can certainly examine that and use that as a conceptual starting point.
Yeah, and I think another thing to add is that, do not change the base files, the files from the starter pack. And I think I also mentioned that below because any important feature updates or, any security or UI changes, we will directly make it to the starter pack. So you might want to keep the base policy exactly the same so that if we have a new base policy, you can quickly, update your current base and none of your underlying or inherited policies will break. So please do not change the base policy. Okay, moving on to the next question. Okay, custom policy will also apply to the user login journey, right? Can we have a technical profile that triggers a web API when the user logs in? I think the question is, can we use a custom policy for a sign-in journey, a sign-in policy? And can we trigger a technical profile that triggers an API when the user logs in?
Yes, on both counts, and there are certainly examples up in there's definitely would call your attention to the CIAM user journey repository. There's basically a sample repository full of all kinds of custom journeys that cover a whole lot of different scenarios. If someone can put that into the Q&A or in the chat area, that would be real handy.
Yeah.
But and then so you don't have to do sign up or sign in. This is very common in scenarios where you may want to preload users either via an import step or via an invitation type of process, rather than letting them self-serve sign up to your identity provider. The other thing is, can you use external web API calls? Yes, that you would use the RESTful technical profile. And we discussed that a bit in the previous session in this series.
Awesome. Any samples that use custom HTML and JavaScript? For that, I have posted, the Woodgrove groceries. We have a public Woodgrove grocery demo, and I've posted the entire code base for that. So that has a whole bunch of samples around JavaScripts and HTML and all that good stuff. And also in the Azure documentation, we have some examples of JavaScript that you can go and take a look at. Okay, the next question is, can we customize the email that sends the code for the verification?
Yes.
Go ahead. Yeah.
In fact, not just a couple months ago, I think this was added to the documentation for how to use your own basically email provider to generate the email that you're going to send. There's a great example for how to use SendGrid to send that email, and you control all of the aspects of that email. Once it's in SendGrid, you can lay that out any way you want. And that's up in the Azure AD B2C docs up on docs.microsoft.com.
Awesome. I think for the next question, there's some questions around, can we group a bunch of orchestration steps and preconditions for each orchestration step? And Jas was answering, a few follow-up questions. Jas, do you just want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, they might have a scenario where you have a set of orchestration steps all using the same preconditions. So this does end up with quite a lot of duplicated code in your custom policy file. So we're looking at that and looking at how we can actually create a subroutine which would contain a set of orchestration steps, and that subroutine could be controlled by one precondition, and that way that would reduce the overall amount of code in the user journey. So we're looking at that, and you may see something soon on that too.
Thank you. We don't have any other new questions, so I think we're done with the questions. Thank you, John.
Okay, yeah, thank you all. Thank everybody. Please remember to fill in the post-event survey. Those are really helpful for us.
Yeah, and if I can add, if any of you are interested in presenting any of these sessions going forward, the series is ending next week, but we might have more sessions coming up. So if you're interested in presenting, reach out to us through the post survey, and we'd be happy to get back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, John, Vinu, and Jazz. And in that post-session survey, let us know if there are any sessions, any sort of things you'd like to see, moving forward after next week. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We really appreciate it.